Hi, everybody. I'm glad to have this room full today for our July's lecture. And happier yet because we know that while we are here talking and listening, our good mentors, the high spirits, are here with us, touching our hearts with their loving care. That's so important to us. Well, first of all, I have a confession to make. Truly, the key theme of this lecture is death. Okay? There's no point to be scared. We won't have any practical exercises. Okay? Not today, not today. Okay? And I just ask you to bear with me so we can stitch up some ideas on this subject. That is a rich one, though scary for many, or should I say for all of us. Okay? So, and the reason why I changed the title of the lecture was because always like this. What happened here? Just a moment. This is not working. It was working.
It was working.
It was working. Let me see if I can do with this. Oh, yes. Well, I changed the title of the lecture because the D words can somehow drive people away, like that leaf blower in the autumn driveway. Okay. So, and this denial of even talking about death is common, despite it's a natural process, we all know, okay? So most people, most of us, we lack that undebatable understanding, okay? In order to support us to have this strong certainty about life after death, or should we say life after life, okay? To clear all fears, okay? And properly help us to weigh in our ties to this material world, okay? And, Christiane, in September 2018, and also Cássio, in last May, they talked about this subject from different angles and important angles. However, I decided to work on this subject again, and I will tell you why. Okay? A long time ago, I stumbled on this article using the D word, Embracing Death as Life's Strongest Medicine by Jean Dini, okay? And a month before Cassio's lecture, I had already prepared a draft for this talk. And I don't think we have coincidence. I bet not. We don't have coincidence. So when Jean Dini, she began to offer death education programs for the public years ago, people questioned her. Hey, Jean, do you have to use the words death, dying in your title? Can't you just say end of life, passing on, crossing over? Can't you talk about life instead? So, however, Jean, years of hospice work had taught her that preparing for death took a lifetime. And it had to start long before the final weeks. So her first program was planning on dying. and it was directed to help people to contemplate mortality and claim a role in their own dying process. Excuse me, it's too hot here today. Another program that she presented was for somatic practitioners. And the name of the program was The Core of Dying. And she also taught college classes on death and dying. Okay? And here she is. That is Gendini, okay? And she asked, why is death so hard to say? And I would add, why is death so hard to hear of? Okay? And what she was saying in that article is that there is this silent denial, okay? There is this solemn pact between people, and most people don't talk about death, and others don't even prepare for death in any sense. And as a result, she says, when death comes, it's most often experienced as a foreign and traumatic event in our lives. It's rarely, she says, a simple process to be supported, to be celebrated even, no less, she says, than a first birthday, a graduation, and I would add, from my spiritist point of view, as a milestone in our history as immortal spirits. So, in other words, she says, death is that big elephant in the room of our human psyche, okay? And she says that there are psychological researches that show how existentially anxious we are as a species in our time, and that how this unconscious fear animates much of our human behavior. So what happens from her point of view is that we generally make two faulty correlations. Death, pain, and trauma are the same thing. And the second one, life and death are opposites, okay? And this opposition between life and death, we should say that it comes from ancient philosophy, okay? But it's here with us, and this pervasive assumption is seen the way that we pair these two words. And we say life and death, life or death, end of life, and etc. Okay. So Jeannie says that sometimes people, in her experience of hospice work, she says that sometimes people correct themselves at bedside or wakes by realizing, by remembering, by come to a deeper truth, which is death is part of life. Okay. And here we jump to Spiritism. How can Spiritism help us? If we go to the chapter 1 of the book Heaven and Hell, which title is The Passage, we read this. Spiritism is not indispensable for securing the well-being of the soul in the other life, and it has no pretension to be the sole agent for it. However, Spiritism facilitates the attainment of that well-being through the knowledge it gives us, through the sentiments it inspires, and through the determination which it awakens in the minds of all who have sincerely accepted the principles, its principles, to labor constantly for their mental and moral advancement. Okay? we should remember that one of the principal battles Allan Kardec fought was the one to demolish the old conceptions about the after death, the meaning of death in our lives, okay? And if we go to the Kardecpedia and we write death in the search engine, we'll have material for hours of study. I hope you'll be curious when you get home, check there. So much material to study about death, okay? So, in the same book that we are talking about, Heaven and Hell, and now in the chapter 2, which was thoroughly analyzed by Christiani in last 2018, and because of that, we will just briefly refresh some ideas so we can move on our reflections today. Okay, in that chapter, we read this. Human beings have an innate presentiment about a future life, and this spontaneous belief in a future state is vastly more general than the belief in annihilation. Then Kardec asks, how is it then that we find among those who do believe in the immortality of the soul, so strong an attachment to the earthly life and so great a dread of death? Okay, you remember Christian's lecture? Well, and Kardec continues in the same chapter of this book, Heaven and Hell, and gives us some explanation about the fear of death. And he tells us, the fear of death is a natural sentiment. At a certain level, mark that, at a certain level, the fear of death is at once a proof of the wisdom of providence and a consequence of the instinct of self-preservation, essential to the well-being of the human race. The fear of death prevents them, men and women, human beings, against the discouragement, which often leads to voluntarily renounce life, so necessary to their advancement. And in the same book, it continues. At the level that it paralyzes us, it is the result of a lack of a true understanding of our origin and destination, the purposes for our earthly life here, and also the true understanding that will lead us, will develop in us this certainty of a future life, okay, of life after life. So we ask us, how can we counterfeit this uncontrolled fear? And Spiritism helps us, telling us that we should look at death from the right point of view. And the right point of view is here in front of us. It's the point of view of the immortal spirits that we are, immortal spirits that belong to the spirit world. A point of view that incentive us to understand this spiritual world, to penetrate in thought at least, okay? That's how we can. And also a point of view that incentivizes us to work on the intellectual and the moral development as immortal spirits that we are. And a point of view that leads us to develop a certain detachment from materiality. So, in that way, we could say, when we adopt this right point of view, we can get prepared for the trip back home, okay? And there's a tip. I have a tip. the same tip that we use in our travels around here. What do? We pack light and only the essential. That's the same tip for our trip back home. Okay? So, and we will find more food for thought and for understanding death and understanding this fear of death in other parts of the doctrine. In the Spirit's book, we read that in the question 149, Kardec asks the spirits what happens to the soul at the time of death. And the spirits answer, it becomes a spirit again. Meaning, it returns to the spirit world that it had briefly left. Just briefly, okay? And continuing, the next question, 150. Does the soul maintain, keeps its individuality after death? And they answer, yes. It never loses it. What would it be if it did not preserve it? Oh, individuality is so important for us, isn't it? Yes. And Kardec continues, does the soul take anything of this life away with it if she packs light? And they say, sorry, only the memory of it. And a desire to move on to a better world. So, from these examples picked up from our doctrine, we can say, we can understand that Spiritism can help us to fight this existential anxiety that Jean Dini said, okay? An anxiety concerning the destruction of our body as being the end of life for us, or the anxiety about whether or not our life will have a continuation as an individuality, okay? And Kardec adds more teaching for us. And he says this very important thing. The fear of death diminishes in proportion as we obtain a clearer anticipation of the future life. And it disappears entirely, he says, when that anticipation has become a certainty. Okay? So, some people say that they do not fear the after death, but they fear the suffering of dying. Okay? Some weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, I heard a spiritist in Brazil in an interview saying that what he fears is how much he will miss his loved ones. And that's so true. But we can say that we as spiritists, we have this spiritual reality displayed before our eyes in the books that we read, okay? In the practice of spiritism, in the mediumship, okay? And in life itself, because it helps us to develop this awareness of our spirituality. And this awareness erases any doubts that we would have regarding to our spiritual reality, regarding life after life. Okay? So we also know that this short span of our present life is nothing compared to the eternity of spirit life. And all this knowledge that we gather, it gives us the stronger reasons to work intensely on our own purification, okay? To fight our evil tendencies. At least we have reasons, stronger reasons, okay? However, there's always a however, in my lectures. However, we all have some death-related fears, okay? Even, we could say, fears that we have acquired in our past experience, in our spiritual life, immortal spiritual life, difficult situations that we have experienced related to death and dying and all this process. Okay? So we need to keep repeating to ourselves. That's why I'm repeating this lecture today on this subject. It is through the inner transformation that we'll develop a better attunement. And this better attunement will make it easier for the good spirits to help us also in the transition, okay? And help us to more easily understand and faster understand where we are. To understand the situation that we'll find ourselves in after the transition. Okay? And we so much need their help of our good spirits. Because death, and here I come to Cassio's lecture, death does not happen in a blink of the eye, okay, in a snap of fingers. No, death is a process. So I didn't lie to you totally in the title of the lecture. Death is a process of transition, a process of disengagement. And that mental confusion that Cassio talked about so well, that mental clouding, is inseparable from this transition. In a higher or lower level, we'll experience this mental clouding. And after all, we could say we will find ourselves in a different dimension, okay? And time and space do not work in the same manner as it works here in our material world. And because of that, the transition can be rocky for some, okay? But if we are willing to experience a more pleasant and rapid disengagement process, okay, we'll need to work on our moral advancement, on the detachment from matter, and most of all, to develop a pure conscience, free of remorses, free of regrets, okay? And Allan Kardec, in the Spiritist Review, 1859, he tells us this. I'll read for you, it's short. For those whose conscience is pure, death is but a momentary sleep, void of suffering, and the awakening from which is unspeakably delightful. And the transition is short and sweet, as death to them is a departure from exile, a return to the true homeland. Beautiful, isn't it? Beautiful and true. So Kardec also talks about prayers. Okay. And he teaches us about the power of prayers. That we can be helped and we can help others in the process of disengagement through prayers. And in the Gospel according to Spiritism, in the chapter 28, we'll get there some months in the future, Kardec addresses the importance of prayers in all situations of our lives. Prayers also for the one who agonizes. Prayer for the one who has just died. Or for the ones who are no longer on earth, independently of the time that had passed. Okay. And from that chapter, I would like to highlight just one short but meaningful quotation, which is this: prayers which truly come from the heart encounter a resonance in the spirit to whom they are directed, whose ideas are still in a state of confusion, as if they, the prayers, were friendly voices come to awaken them from sleep. So beyond the sounding theory containing the principles about death and dying, the moments that precede, during, and after that we find in Spiritism, Kardec also brings us real-life examples. And those real-life examples come to reinforce our understanding and also our certainty of life after life. Especially in the book Heaven and Hell, we find examples that we can compare to the cases that life offers us daily, okay? And remarkably, we should say that the same kind of situations are repeated in the mediumistic sessions everywhere, in all times. And here is what Kardec wrote as a footnote in the chapter 1 of the book Heaven and Hell about the real-life examples. Well, he says, we have, on the contrary, selected the experiences of those whose earthly existence was undergone amidst the ordinary circumstances of life of our own day. Ordinary people, just like us, okay? Because it is from these that the greatest sum of instruction can be drawn. So I went there and I chose two examples. One from the book Heaven and Hell and one from the Spiritist magazine. And I wish we could read together because they really reinforce our understanding and our certainty. So the first example is about a happy spirit, okay? Maurice Gontran. Maurice Gontran was an only son who died at the age of 18 of tuberculosis, a rare intelligence, reasoning powers beyond his years, beyond his age, a great love of study, gentle, affectionate, sympathetic, okay? And when they asked the Spirit during his communication at the Spiritist Society of Paris if he had suffered when dying, here is just some excerpts about what he answered. I only suffered before dying from the disease that carried me off, but that suffering diminished as the last moments drew near. Then, one day, I fell asleep without any thought of death. I began to dream. Such a delightful dream. I dreamed that I was cured. I felt no more pain. I breathed in with sound lungs and with inexpressible enjoyment, a fragrant and life-giving air. I felt myself transported through space by an unknown force. I was in the midst of light that dazzled me with its splendor, and yet it did not fatigue my sight. And he continues, I saw my grandfather, how lucky he was. His face was no longer thin and worn, but was fresh and youthful. He held out his arms to me and clasped me joyfully to his bosom. A crowd of people came with him, all smiling as they met me and welcoming me with kindness and satisfaction. I seemed to remember them. I rejoiced to see them again, and we exchanged cordial greetings and expressions of friendship. Well, what I took to be a dream was a reality. I was never again to awaken upon the earth. I had awakened in the spirit world. Beautiful, isn't it? This communication. Okay, but now let's go to Mr. X. Mr. X, a spirit in his own funeral. Okay, Mr. X had just been victimized by a stroke. A few hours after his death, Mr. Adrian, and by the way, Mr. Adrian was a medium at the Spiritist Society and coincidentally his friend, okay? Mr. Adrian, one of his friends, was in the mortuary chamber with the wife of the deceased. Mr. Adrian clearly saw the spirit walking in all directions, alternatively looking to the body and to those around it, and later sitting on a chair. And he had the exact same appearance as he had when alive. Okay? On the following day, during the funeral, Mr. Adrian saw the spirit of his friend again, wandering by the side of the coffin, and the conversation that we are going to read was established between Mr. Adrian, the medium, and the spirit, okay? And Mr. Adrian, Kardec remarks, was not a somnambulist. And he was perfectly awake during both times that he saw the spirit and talked with him. And in the day of the funeral, the spirit appeared to him much like one of the guests at the funeral. So here is part of the conversation between them. Tell me, my dear spirit, what do you feel now? Comfort and suffering. I don't understand that. Comfort and suffering? Well, said the spirit, I feel that I'm living my real life. However, I see my body here in this casket. I touch myself. I don't feel a thing. Nevertheless, I feel that I'm alive, that I exist. Will I then be two beings? How I want to exit this darkness, this nightmare. So Mr. Adrian asks him, will you remain like that for long? Oh no, thank God, my friend, I feel that I will soon wake up. It would be horrible otherwise. My thoughts are confused. It is all obscurity. I think about the great division, the transition, the death. I think about the great division that has just happened. And that is what I don't understand at all. So Mr. Adrian asks him, which effect has death produced on you? And his answer, death? I'm not dead, my son. You are mistaken. I was just standing up and suddenly I was taken by a darkness that covered my eyes. Then I stood up and imagined my amazement by seeing myself feeling alive, having my other self lying on the cold floor. My thoughts were confused. I unsuccessfully tried to put myself together. I saw my wife arriving at the wake, mourning for me, but I asked myself why. I offered her consolation, speaking with her, but she did not reply nor understand. And he continues. That was what tortured me and made my spirit even more perturbed. Only you, to Mr. Adrian, lessen my pain as you heard me and you understand what I want. You helped me to clarify my thoughts and did me a great deal. But why don't the others do the same? That's what tortures me. My mind is smashed by that pain. I will see her, the wife. She might understand me now. So long, my dear friend. Call me that I will come to see you. I will pay you a friendly visit. Will surprise you. So long. Okay, Kardec puts an observation after this communication, and he says that the description that the Spirit gives is in agreement, confirms everything that he had observed about the phenomena of the separation of the soul. Okay, the Spirit sometimes is still present after death, and the only difference between him, the discarnate one, and the others is the visibility or the invisibility. That the separation between the soul and the body does not happen instantly at the last heartbeat. Not always. Sometimes it starts before the real death, while the body is in agony. And it happens more or less slowly, according to the circumstances of death. And up to the moment of its liberation, the soul experiences that perturbation, that confusion. Okay? A confusion that hinders the awareness of the soul's actual condition. And the soul, Kardec brings us a comparison. The soul is in the state of a person that awakes up with confusing ideas. Okay? And such a state is not painful for the man whose conscience is pure, as he said, and we had highlighted before. So, I would like to conclude our talking now, bringing another voice from the scientific field. Okay? A voice that supports the significance of the D moment in our lives as a milestone for us, spirits. And he's a voice that reassures all the theory and the examples that we find in Spiritism. And I'm talking about Dr. Peter Fenwick. Okay. Dr. Peter Fenwick, a neuropsychiatrist, neurophysiologist. He is known for his studies of epilepsy and end-of-life phenomena. Well, he gave a TED Talk. And the title of the TED Talk is there on YouTube. Excellent one, The Final Border. I think Cássio had watched it before. The Final Border, as is in the title. Okay, The Final Border. And Dr. Fenwick, in that TED Talk, he tells his audience that all are going to die. And most are afraid of it because they don't know what is going to happen. And when he asks his audience, what are we afraid of? He already had the answers, the reassuring answers to them, not to be afraid. Well, Dr. Fenwick talks about what happens when we die, based on real cases of his experience as a clinician, an expert in brain functions also. And he has collected more than 300 cases, and more than 1,500 stories came to his hands during the time that he presented a radio program about this subject. Okay? And to the question. And he wrote this book, The Art of Dying, and together with his wife, okay? So when Dr. Fenwick asks, what happens when we die? As a specialist in human consciousness, Dr. Fenwick witnessed many fascinating phenomena on the dying process, during the dying process. And what he experienced and tells us is that people have visions of family coming, protecting, comforting at bedside, but not the incarnate family, the discarnate members of the family, okay? Also, people experience feelings of unity, wholeness, and healing, love and compassion. And towards the very end, the peaceful experience of a new reality. And he adds one more thing. I chose this. People that were together with the dying person would see visible light in the room. Sometimes a light like a candlelight in a corner of the room, or sometimes a light involving the person that was dying. Okay? So Dr. Fenwick, with his experience, he gives us good advices. And you are late, sorry. Okay? And among the advices that he gives, he says, please learn about it, okay? Know that experiences of spiritual awakening can and do exist independent of religious attitudes. Develop feelings of acceptance, and most of all, understand that everything must be given up. Even people, our loved ones, at least for some time. We know that, but everything must be given up, okay? And although Dr. Fenwick's conclusions of the spiritual reality after the process of dying may be different from what we learn in Spiritism about the keeping of our individuality, the results that he got in his experiences, in his experience as a clinic, they replicate, they come in the same way that we learn in Spiritism about the process of death, okay? And he gives us another good advice, and I will really end the talk with this good advice now. He tells us that death is a totally fascinating time that shows our connectedness, but most of all, our interconnectedness. He says that, okay? And he tells us, if you are willing to have a good death, clean your attic. But most importantly, clean your relationships. And with this, I will end here. Thank you for putting up with me, asking God to bless us all in our path of this important understanding in our lives. Thank you. God bless you.